I barely remember him. Barely remember him. It was somebody that went out and wrote a book and said all sorts of terrible things that were all lies. And it was like he was this gentleman or that gentleman, like I dealt with him all the time. I had no idea who this guy. I said, who the hell is Miles Taylor? And he made a living on going on CNN talking about the president. And I think what he did, he wrote a book, Anonymous, said all sorts of lies, bad things. And I think it's like a traitor. It's like spying. He walks into the office. He's supposed to be sitting here. A lot of people, I'll be here, and there'll be 20 people standing in the room. There'll be oftentimes young people in the office. I assume he was one of them at least. But I didn't know anything about him. And he wrote a book, Anonymous, and I always thought it was terrible. And now we have a chance to find out whether or not it was terrible. But it was a work of fiction. Got a lot of publicity. Got himself a nice job with CNN, or one of them. And I think we have to do something about it. You can't have that happen. If that happens to other presidents, it wouldn't be sustainable for other presidents. They seem to be able to sustain. But if that happened to other presidents, I mean, it's just unfair. And if it was a Democrat president, I'd say that's a terrible thing. A thing like that can happen. That's a terrible thing. And it's time to find out whether or not somebody can do that. Can they write a book about very confidential meetings, and because they happen to be one of a lot of people in a room, and they go out and write a book, and worse than that, call it anonymous, like it's a big deal, and everybody saying, who is it, who is it, who is it? Then it was found out who he was a long time later, and he got a lot of publicity off that one. He's like a promoter. But we're going to find out whether or not somebody's allowed to do that. I think it's a very important case, and I think he's guilty of treason, if you want to know the truth. But we'll find out. And I assume we're recommending this to the Department of Justice.
An accusation there of treason for Miles Taylor, a former official at the Department of Homeland Security. Joining our conversation is the publisher of The Bulwark, host of the podcast, The Focus Group. Sarah Longwell's here. A long-time journalist who's covered Trump for a long time said that after this reversal, having to reverse himself on tariffs because the markets were so bad, they were an embarrassment to Donald Trump. She said, she warned, she said, he'll become meaner. He'll turn up the volume on the retribution stuff and the cruelty on the domestic front. I don't know that there's any correlation. Those executive orders look typed up and ready to go and ready to hand to him. Maybe it was always the plan to do that today. But what is your sense of the political backdrop against which all of today's events have taken place?
First of all, let me just say how insane it is that the mechanism by which he is attacking these people is an executive order. Why would that be? I mean, it's one thing if he wants to be upset or he wants to pursue litigation if he thinks claims have been made, but to sign an executive order attacking these people, especially Chris Krebs. I mean, Chris Krebs, all he did was rebuke the president's false claim that the election wasn't stolen as somebody in his administration. And here's what Trump is trying to do. Look, I don't know how much of it. You never know with Donald Trump. Is he trying to distract you like a guy with a laser pointer and the media is a bunch of cats? Is he trying to get people to chase things so they stop talking about the fact that he caved and did a total about face on the tariffs after telling us for days that he wasn't going to do a pause, and now he's suddenly pausing because the world economy is collapsing? Is he doing this as a distraction? I don't know, but on its face, it is incredibly pernicious for him to sign executive orders and launch investigations into people simply for speaking out against what they saw from his administration. And also what he was saying there is, though, it's like highly unusual. Look, lots of books get written by people who are insiders in administrations who talk about the things that happened in the rooms. That's actually very common. That's what reporters do. And what he's trying to do here, though, is to make people afraid of speaking out against him. Not just people from before, but people who are there now. People who have an understanding of what he's doing and who, as people are looking for insight, he's saying, if you leak, because people leak against Trump all the time. I mean, nobody leaks against Trump more because people inside are trying to make Trump not do crazy things, right? By telling the media he's about to do crazy things. And so leaking is like a mechanism for them to curb some of Trump's worst impulses. And so he's trying to make people afraid by saying he's going to launch investigations into anybody who speaks out. I mean, this is some of the most insane authoritarian stuff we've seen out of him.
Sarah, you made a perfect point, though, I think, to start this conversation about the laser pointer. I mean, the two stories that have left a mark are the man-made debacle of the tariff announcement, as well as Signalgate, another man-made national security crisis. Talk about sort of the wear and tear that those two sort of twin self-inflicted crises have taken on his early presidency.
Well, just on Signalgate really quickly, the idea that Donald Trump is a real stalwart around classified information, considering that both he left a bunch of classified documents in his bathroom at Mar-a-Lago, he refused to return those documents. He's also held nobody accountable for Signalgate. And the only reason we stopped talking about the fact that our national security was so compromised by that, because they added a journalist to their signal chain as they discussed attack plans, is because the economy was crashing around us. And this is what Donald Trump does, right? He lurches us from crisis to crisis, many of them of his own making, and then he acts like he's solved the crisis when he does something like announce a 90-day pause. But these are things that had been breaking through, especially the economic. I mean, I've been doing focus groups all week. People are very nervous about the state of the economy. They are very scared. People who are his supporters have been very nervous about what they're seeing. And so, when you say the wear and tear, here's what I know. I know that it usually takes until the summer for somebody's own voters, a president's own voters, to start to say, "Ugh, I'm not sure I made the right choice," or "I'm not liking what I'm seeing." Donald Trump, it's taken him 2 months before he's got voters starting to say, "What is this guy doing? And why is he doing it? This is nuts."
I want to ask you one more quick question about politics, and then I want to bring John Heilemann into our conversation. Miles Taylor has responded to Trump's attack. One of the things that we've talked about for 9 years, and it feels like snowflakes, right? But there is a thing in the Trump voter that they need an off-ramp. And I wonder if the tariffs and the intentional damage to the economy is one such off-ramp. You know, Donald Trump talked awkwardly about groceries, but he did run on making things cheaper. And he did, the day he got elected, start talking about things going up. I wonder if that sort of bait and switch has registered.
No, it is absolutely registered. And here's the thing. I always try to make this distinction between the hardcore MAGA types, right, who are going to give Trump a lot of leeway, and the big part of the Trump voter coalition were just people who wanted prices lowered. And they're different from hardcore MAGA people, right? They wanted things to be cheaper. Trump's a businessman. I think he's going to make things cheaper. And when he fails to do that, it drives a knife through right through the heart of the central mythology around Trump, which is that his business acumen can somehow make the economy better for everybody. And so that's what's happening right now, is people are feeling like, oh, wait, he's not making the economy better. Prices aren't going down. And I think that is the off-ramp, not for everybody in the Trump coalition, but for a certain chunk of voters.
Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd is our special guest. She's actually interviewed Donald Trump for decades, as well as presidents, actors, cultural icons, and more. Her new book, Notorious, is not about Notorious B.I.G., the acclaimed Brooklyn rapper, although they share that name. It draws on her writing and profiles of people who are interesting, are powerful, or are, of course, notorious. Beloved by so many readers and viewers. Your first time on The Beat. We've asked before. You're now here. I'm happy to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ari.
Great to have you.
Very nervous.
Well, it's okay. People will find that charming that you're nervous after being so established. The Pulitzer doesn't wipe it away. Let's start with the news and then go to the book. I mentioned this contrast. Smart people who seem shocked after this much time. What do you think of that, and how does that affect the sort of market reaction?
I don't know. You know, with Trump, it's like being governed by an id. I mean, his biographers always said he would get distilled to his essence, and I think he's at his essence.
How do you view his essence, politically and in these policy choices?
Yeah, he's the mad king, the high chair king. He's, well, you can't say he can't multitask, because right now he was wrecking the economy. He has wrecked our relationship with our allies. He has wrecked our standing in the world. He has wrecked the Kennedy Center. He has wrecked the Oval Office. It looks like Caesar's Palace now. But today he issued an executive order making sure that the water pressure in showers was right. So the guy can do many things at once.
What does it tell us about us?
Well, you know, Americans have always been susceptible to con men, certainly. And, you know, it was funny because today was the day when it's like that scene in movies and literature where the con man, you realize the con man really doesn't have the product, you know, you're conned. And that's when the market freaked out. And the market is one of the few things he cares about. So he had to backtrack.
Yeah, and you see it in the teams he's put together, and you're around this as a longtime New York Times columnist, and you are the type of columnist who actually interviews people and talks to people, and there's different ways to do it. And we do this interview show. I've had a lot of Trump figures on. I still do. I had his former DHS chief last week, and the invites are open to the White House. And there is something really striking about what he gets out of people, even with all of this done in public. And Navarro, who literally went to prison on a Trump-fueled agenda or crusade, is now rewarded with a White House position, but then very unrewarded by becoming the sort of fall guy for all of this, with Elon Musk, if ever there were a more powerful workplace vendetta, just dragging him online and the personal insults. And then here's how the White House tried to explain it. Take a look.
Look, these are obviously two individuals who have very different views on trade and on tariffs. Boys will be boys, and we will let their public sparring continue.
It was entertaining to see the MAGA coalition of billionaires begin to fracture and go after each other. And Elon called Navarro dumb as a bag of bricks, and then he apologized to bricks.
He apologized to bricks, that's correct.
So, and then Ken Langone freaked out and Bill Ackman freaked out. But, you know, as you say, didn't they see it coming? I mean, Trump's position on tariff, that's one of the few positions he has had his whole career. So, you know, but with con men, it's a yearning in you for something. So they have their reasons. They're all transactional, and they chose him.
Yeah, you say reasons. We are told, if you go to study political science or you go to law school, we're told a lot about rules and policy and this sort of narrative about how Washington works. You are a chronicler of this, among other things. Tell me about your book and these figures. It seems that you're trying to peel past that and find what you just referenced, psychology, the other, what some call sinful motivations. That it's not the other story that we're so often told.
Yeah, well, I am drawn to larger-than-life Shakespearean figures, although Trump is kind of more P.T. Barnum than Shakespearean. But, and for my whole career, I have covered politics, but also culture. And so Washington and Hollywood always struck me as kind of mirror cities because they're about, you know, people who are able to ensorcel and winning and losing, and one is box office and one is approval ratings. And then I added in Silicon Valley in the last few years, and that's the same. You know, they have these larger-than-life figures who are controlling all our communications and, to a certain extent, our emotions. You know, Silicon Valley guys. And so they are so important, and then they are obsessed with clicks. So, the three areas are reflecting off of each other.
And in Silicon Valley, they have been trying to sell, I don't think it's working lately, but for many years, sell the idea that it's not really money that they're interested in. It's rewiring and disrupting the world as we know it for what is presumably a better, more connected place. And you were skeptical of that early on. This is from a piece in the book about Musk back years ago and he has done, and I've said on air, he's done plenty of interesting things and created capital. But you say some in the Valley argue Musk is interested less in saving the world, was something he talked a lot about, than buffing his brand. They gripe his epic good versus evil storyline is about luring talent at discount rates, incubating his own AI software for his cars and rockets.
Well, when I interviewed Elon Musk the first time in 2017, he didn't like Trump. Although I do another interview with Peter Thiel where he predicts they will get together because they're grandmaster salesmen and larger-than-life figures. But when I interviewed the Silicon Valley guys in 2017, they were not paying attention to Washington at all because they were busy creating a new species. I mean, they are creating AI, which will very soon, begin. It's in its teenage years, but very soon it will become adult. And then that was what I interviewed Elon about because he called it summoning the demon. And he thought we should have a kill switch. And he formed OpenAI with Sam Altman to make sure humanity had advocates and that's why he wanted to go to Mars. But then someone explained to him that AI could follow him to Mars, so we couldn't really get away from killer AI.
President Trump's announcement that he was pausing some tariffs for 90 days came as U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer tried to defend Trump's policies before the House Ways and Means Committee. And Nevada Democratic Congressman Stephen Harsford pressed Greer on what he learned of the change in policy.
How long is the pause? How many days? How many weeks?
I understand it's 90 days. I haven't spoken to the president since I've been in
So the
this
trade
hearing.
representative hasn't spoken to the president of the United States about a global reordering of trade.
Yes, I have. I've just been in the hearing with you, sir.
But yet he announced it on a tweet? WTF? Who's in charge?
The president of the United States is in charge.
And what do you know about those details?
Well, as I mentioned...
it looks like your boss just pulled the rug out from under you and paused the tariffs. This is amateur hour, and it needs to stop.
Back with me now are Ali Velshi, Tim O'Brien, Molly Jung Fast. And a shock to absolutely no one, Tim, that, it is a characterization that the rug was probably pulled from underneath him. I suspect he did not know that the announcement was coming when it came, and certainly the fact that it came by tweet speaks for itself. But it's interesting to note that while that hearing was happening, this is what Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick posted, that Scott Bessent and I sat with the president while he posted this reversal on tariffs. And it seems like Trump didn't include his own trade representative in the making of this decision.
And it's not clear who he actually consulted with before he even put out White House policy and a major economic and trade development on Truth Social instead of sending it through normal channels and baking some sort of adult behavior into the messaging. When Jamieson Greer said the President of the United States is in charge, it's clear that he is a one-man show, but he is not running the federal government in a mature, sophisticated, process-driven way that has nothing necessarily to do with ideology or partisan politics. There's just no big, important organization that you would run as if it was Cirque du Soleil. and that's what he's doing. And he's doing it day in and day out. And the damage of this is going to be long-lasting. People were shocked when Brexit occurred and the UK essentially turned its back on Europe. What the United States has done in the first 3 months of this year is of an order of magnitude beyond that. And there's going to be reputational, diplomatic, and economic damage that the American public's going to have to live with for a very long time.
And let me go back to this point about the countries that have reached out to Donald Trump. Obviously, reporters today pressed the White House to say, hey, give us a list. NBC News is reporting in response to repeated queries. A White House spokesperson said it will not release the list of the 75 countries that it says have reached out about making trade deals. Why? Why are they, what are they hiding?
Maybe
Could
they
it possibly
don't
be that they
exist.
don't actually
Yeah,
have
maybe they're
75
not
duties?
there.
And there's so much uncertainty, too, with Canada and Mexico. It's not clear what the tariffs are there. There was reporting that there was an extra 10 put on it, maybe, maybe not. No, look, what do we know? Markets love uncertainty. I'm just kidding. Markets hate uncertainty. You've got a president who's governing by tweet. This is all self-inflicted. That's the other thing. This is all completely self-inflicted. And you're seeing his poll numbers, the poll numbers from Liberation Day, he's back to where he usually is, 41%.
Oh, we have this Quinnipiac poll that says 55% disapprove of Trump's handling of the economy.
Right.
To your point.
But
And at the end of the day, he's letting it be known that he's going to adjust water flow out of shower heads.
Right.
Because he's irked that he can't wash his beautiful locks.
Right, but I
so
mean-
after a day
Yeah.
of messes like this, he's still
But
not.
he squandered so much goodwill. And the reality is he came in with pretty good numbers, for him, especially good numbers.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the disappearing the grad students. It wasn't the attacks on democracy. It really was this tariff fiasco that really turned a lot of his people against him.
Ali, we are now entering a 90-day pause given the whiplash from President Trump just in the last weekend. What do you see happening 3 months from now?
Well, one of the things that the White House press secretary said today is we're playing the long game. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. This is the opposite of the long game, right? The U.S.-Mexico trade agreement that Donald Trump made NAFTA into himself, that's a long game. That's a negotiation. The Iran nuclear deal took 10 years to negotiate. The U.S. got involved in the last 2 years of it. That's the long game. And then he ripped it up, and now he wants to deal with Iran, apparently. NATO is the long game. These trade deals are the long game. This is nonsensical. Every 8 hours changing your policies, number one. Number two, that poll you cited from Quinnipiac, it says people's major concerns about the economy are food and the cost of goods, number one. Number two, housing and the cost of rent. Number three, they're worried about other things. And number four, their jobs, because unemployment is actually very low and we're throwing a whole lot of immigrants out of the country. Number one is the cost of goods, the housing cost. You put a tariff on Canada. You know where our lumber comes from? Comes from Canada. You're going to make the price of a house $10,000 more expensive. We know in this last election, the price of housing was too expensive. Now, here's another thing. Talking about this day on the market, you'll see that it was the best day in 5 years in the stock market. Well, again, we're from a base, we've come down. So ignore it for a little bit. But you need 2.5 to 3 more days like this just to get back to last week before Donald Trump started his nonsense. So like this is real wealth, real value. Tim was talking about Brexit. Brexit was a disaster.
Yeah.
It was a disaster. There's nobody in the UK who says we're better off because you did this. It just doesn't work. It's dumb on every level. So I don't know what the next 90 days holds because that's 180 news cycles, Eamon. So I suspect we're going to get to talk about it a lot.
Trump backed down. That was the New York Times headline today. When Trump backed down, as predicted exactly 24 hours ago on this program. I mean, I didn't say it was going to be today. I didn't know that. But I did say the only way this was going to end, the only way was with Donald Trump backing down in the next few days, I suggested last night, or in a few months. The moron, as Elon Musk calls him, was nowhere to be seen in the media opportunities at the White House surrounding the great event of Donald Trump backing down today. Donald Trump's tariff advisor, Peter Navarro, was reportedly not in the room in the Oval Office when Donald Trump was composing his tweet that would revive the stock market today. But Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was. And it was the Treasury Secretary standing alone beside the White House press secretary in the White House driveway for the dramatic televised version of the announcement heard around the world today. In what turned out to be the biggest media day of the year at the Trump White House, Elon Musk was nowhere to be seen. Elon Musk was silent today about the biggest news that Donald Trump has made in his presidency. Donald Trump backing down from his trade war was even bigger news than Donald Trump starting his trade war. And Elon Musk was silent about what Donald Trump did today. Yesterday, Elon Musk was calling Donald Trump's chief tariff advisor, Peter Navarro, a moron and saying that he was, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks. And then, of course, apologizing for insulting bricks. Yesterday, Elon Musk was enlisting his little brother to attack Peter Navarro and Donald Trump about the Trump tariffs directly. But today, Elon Musk was silent. But Kimball Musk was not silent. Kimball Musk, as we have reported to you, is Elon Musk's younger brother, who is a wholly owned subsidiary of Elon Musk and a member of the Tesla board, which means he is unlikely to ever say a word publicly that his older brother and boss does not approve of. And I mean word for word. At 9:47 a.m., a little more than 3 hours before Donald Trump announced that he was backing down, Kimball Musk attacked directly by name J.D. Vance and Donald Trump on Twitter. Kimball Musk identified a tweet by J.D. Vance saying, "It's bizarre to see all the limousine socialists screech desperately for dependence on Chinese supply chains and inflated equities. The Musk brothers and Tesla are entirely dependent on Chinese supply chains." And so Kimball Musk replied to J.D. Vance saying, "Republicans for higher prices. How about that? This Trump tariff tax has driven prices for everyday goods through the roof. J.D. Vance, I read your book. It's good. I'd think you'd have more sympathy for your community's cost of living. Inflation sucks for everyone, but it especially hits our underserved communities the most. And we all know how much the Musk brothers worry about our underserved communities who cannot afford to buy Teslas." So there's the Musk team at 9:47 a.m. calling it the Trump tariff tax and saying J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are now the leaders of Republicans for higher prices. Why did Elon Musk shy away from the Twitter battle this morning? When did Elon Musk know that his stock price was going to start climbing back up today because Donald Trump was going to announce that he was backing down? The potential for insider trading on that information today was unlimited. Donald Trump all but admitted that it was in the middle of the night last night that the bond market scare made him realize that his time was up.
Was it the bond markets that persuaded you to reverse course?
I was watching the bond market. The bond market is very tricky. I was watching it, but if you look at it now, it's beautiful. The bond market right now is beautiful. But yeah, I saw last night where people were getting a little queasy.
Of course, he doesn't actually understand the bond market. They weren't getting a little queasy. It was panic, justifiable panic. And the president's morning TV diet didn't help.
Did you speak with anyone, Jamie Dimon? Did you speak with anyone?
Well, I watched Jamie Dimon on Maria Bartiromo's show this morning, and he was very good.
Here is what Donald Trump heard the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, tell him this morning about what was coming if he didn't back down.
How significant would you expect that? Do you personally expect a recession?
I am going to defer to my economists at this point, but I think probably that's a likely outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because markets, I mean, when you see a 2,000 point decline, it sort of feeds on itself, doesn't it? Because it makes you feel like you're losing money in your 401k, you're losing money in your pension.
So imagine Donald Trump with all those White House breakfast pastries spread out in front of him, watching Jamie Dimon and Maria Bartiromo agree that a recession is coming thanks entirely to Donald Trump. The Trump recession had already had a name. As much as Donald Trump loves naming everything after himself, that's the one thing he never wanted named after him, the next recession. But the chances of a recession are still high because after Donald Trump backed down, Goldman Sachs reduced the chances of a recession from 65% down to 45%, which is still dangerously high and much higher than it was on Donald Trump's inauguration day when exactly no one was predicting a recession was even possible thanks to the Biden economy that Donald Trump inherited and lied about today.
Joe Biden handed us over a country that was in very serious trouble economically.
Joe Biden handed him the greatest economy any president has ever handed another president. The stock market crash created by Donald Trump could only be reversed by Donald Trump backing down. Donald Trump has twice now proved beyond a reasonable doubt, including today, that the stock market crash was all about him. The first time he proved it was Monday when CNBC reported on a rumor floated on Twitter that Donald Trump was considering a 90-day pause in his worldwide tariff madness. We showed you how that drama unfolded on CNBC in real time on Monday for about 20 minutes. When the stock market believed that rumor, the stock market just shot straight up. And then CNBC's reliable White House reporter, Eamon Javers, reported that the White House press secretary denied that rumor, and that denial then sank the stock market immediately once again. 2 days later, with the stock market in more danger than ever after a terrifying turn of events in the bond market overnight, Donald Trump announced on Twitter that he was backing down. He announced his 90-day pause that we all know is a forever pause. If you were awake after midnight last night watching Bloomberg's live coverage of what was happening in the bond market overnight around the world, you saw some very dark predictions for what was to come in the stock market today. We know Donald Trump, the admitted insomniac, was awake after midnight when the bond market was crashing. He was probably on the phone with his Treasury Secretary then, who was surely advising him that it was time to give up and back down. And so probably from the approximately midnight last night until 1:18 p.m. today, when Donald Trump announced that he was backing down, Donald Trump, and who knows how many other people in and around the White House, knew that Donald Trump was going to back down. That means they were in possession of the most valuable investment inside information in the world. And that is why some senators were wondering today just how much insider trading might have been going on in and around the Trump White House before Donald Trump made his announcement that sent the stock market skyrocketing back up, but not all the way back up to where it was before Donald Trump started his economic death march of the last 7 days.
Absolutely. I'm writing to the White House to demand who knew in advance that the president was going to once again flip-flop on tariffs, and are people cashing in? There is just all too much opportunity for people in the White House and the administration to be insider trading, and you can't put it past them for a minute. So we're going to try to find out.
This administration is replete with grifters. Corruption is its middle name. And I have no doubt that an investigation of stock dealing, as well as potentially other investments, is going to reveal deep corruption in this administration. Insider trading is a real threat here, and I hope there will be a searching, penetrating investigation into the potential for manipulation and insider trading of securities.
In the war of Donald Trump versus the world, Donald Trump lasted much longer than I thought he would at the beginning of his war. He lasted almost a full 7 days. I didn't expect Donald Trump to keep fighting his war after 1 day of the stock market crashing. I didn't think Donald Trump was crazy enough to accept even 1 full day of the stock market crashing, but I was wrong about that. In the House Ways and Means Committee today, Congressman Stephen Horsford asked the person who is supposed to be in charge of international trade policy in the administration, but is not, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, if what we were watching today was the manipulation of the stock market so that some people could have a very good day in that stock market.
We have people that are planning to send their kids to college this fall. People who are retiring whose benefits have declined. Is this market manipulation?
No.
Why not? If it was a plan, if it was always the plan, how is this not market manipulation?
It's not market manipulation, sir.
Well, then what is it? Because it sure is not a strategy.
We're trying to reset the global trade system.
You're,
That's offshored, offshored all of our factories.
And what has that done? How have you achieved any of that? But to enact enormous harm on the American people, which was our concern from the very beginning. Tariffs are a tool. It can be used in the appropriate way to protect U.S. jobs and small businesses. But that's not what this does. So if it's not market manipulation, what is it? Who's benefiting? What billionaire just got richer? And all the while, there are not even any Republicans left in this hearing. They all left because they don't even want to defend this. But meanwhile, the Speaker is rushing to the floor to pass a budget reconciliation to screw America by passing the biggest tax cut in history on the backs of the American people. WTF? Who's in charge?
It seems if anyone can be said to be in charge, it is Elon Musk. One day after Elon Musk called Donald Trump's tariff advisor a moron, without saying that makes Donald Trump a moron for following a moron's advice, which is the obvious implication, Donald Trump started following Elon Musk's advice, and he backed down. As I said last night, Donald Trump, if he managed to sleep after learning about what was happening in the bond market, was going to have to try to fall asleep knowing that he was probably next. That if Elon Musk was calling Donald Trump's tariff advisor a moron, the next logical person for Elon Musk to call a moron was the person taking the moron's advice. And Donald Trump was not prepared to live more than 24 hours of suspense of when Elon Musk might start calling him a moron. And so Elon Musk, in his public silence today, got Donald Trump to do what he wanted him to do today. But Elon Musk is not finished. Elon Musk needs Tesla to be exempted from the tariffs on goods coming into this country from China, because assembling a Tesla in the United States involves using components built in China.
Sir, would you consider exempting some U.S. companies, maybe some larger companies who have been hit hard in the markets the last few days during this 90 days?
As time goes by, we're going to take a look at it. There are some that have been hard. There are some that, by the nature of the company, get hit a little bit harder, and we'll take a look at that. Yeah.
How do you determine the next 90 days?
Just instinctively, more than anything else.
So how are you going to determine which companies will be allowed to import goods from China without a tariff on them? And the answer is instinctively. That's what Donald Trump said. Donald Trump's going to do it in a way where there will be no rules at all for how he does it. There will be no legal process for how he does it. Donald Trump's going to do it instinctively. That was his word. In other words, Donald Trump is going to do it for the richest person in the world who has given him more money than anyone alive. Donald Trump is going to instinctively make sure that Tesla is able to import whatever it needs to import from China without the burden of the Trump tariffs. Donald Trump said, quote, "We're going to take a look at it. There are some that have been hit hard. That means Tesla. There are some that by the nature of the company get hit a little bit harder. That means Tesla. And we'll take a look at that," he said. "We'll take a look at that." Yeah. And so, on what may have been the day that saw more insider trading in Washington than any other day in history, we embarked on the beginning of the most corrupt possible arrangements for deciding what companies will not have to pay the Trump tariffs on which goods imported from which countries. Lobbyists will make hundreds of millions of dollars this year alone lobbying the Trump White House on that very issue. And Elon Musk will be lobbying Donald Trump directly, right in his ear, while Elon Musk can remain, as he did today, publicly silent.
Quote, do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling his job as president? Disapprove by a margin of 12 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the federal workforce? Disapprove by a margin of 13 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling foreign policy? Disapprove by a margin of 14 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the economy? Disapprove by a margin of 15 points. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Trump is handling trade? Disapprove by a margin of 16 points. All right, well, how about this one? How about his signature issue, a thing that he actually did run on when he campaigned for president, a thing he really most wants to be associated with, the policy that he most wants you to identify with him and his name. Do you think, American public, do you think it is a good thing, his signature issue? Here's the way the question was phrased. Thinking about the short term, do you think President Trump's tariffs will help or hurt the U.S. economy? The proportion of Americans who say Trump's tariffs gonna help, 22%. The proportion of Americans who say Trump's tariffs will hurt us is 72%. So by a 50-point margin, Americans believe that Donald Trump is deliberately hurting us with his big signature policy idea of these genius tariffs. By a 50-point margin, Americans say what he's doing is hurtful to us deliberately. Which brings us to what I mentioned at the top, our spelunking expedition together this evening, our exploration of caves. The incident of Donald Trump caving today that's getting the most attention, understandably so, is his panicked cave, his panicked U-turn on tariffs. For all his famed and supposed attention to the stock market, I got to tell you, Donald Trump has been very happy to preside over huge off-the-cliff plunges in the stock market repeatedly. In fact, in history, if you look at the Dow Jones, if you look at the 10 largest single-day point drops in the Dow in history, of the 10 worst point drops ever on the Dow, Donald Trump was the president for 9 of those 10 days. Some were in his first term, some were this past week with the tariffs debacle. Yeah. He was president for 9 of the 10 worst one-day point drops on the Dow. And you might say there's, the takeaway message there is, wow, why would any Wall Street person, any business person, anyone with a single share of stock, anyone with a retirement account, why would any of those folks ever support this particular person for president? Reasonable question. But the other takeaway here is about him and not just how good or not he is for stocks. The other takeaway here, I think it's fair to say, is that he doesn't much care about tanking the stock market all the time. It's like a day that ends in Y for him. He's famous for doing it. What happened today that was different? After all his remaining tariff threats went into effect at midnight last night, what happened today was not that the stock market tanked. It did at the beginning of the day with the tariffs in place, but that's, again, normal for a day with Donald Trump at the wheel. What was different today was not that the stock market tanked again, right? It was that the bond market tanked at the beginning of the day. And you don't have to know that much about the markets to know that when things go crazy economically, and even sometimes when things just go crazy in other ways, people rush to put their money somewhere safe. And for decades, for the entire span of America's global economic dominance, the safe place that people have run to when stuff is crazy has been U.S. bonds, American Treasury bonds, because when the world is going nuts, for whatever reason, you can at least count on the full faith and credit of the government of the United States of America, right? But we're in a new environment now, because it turns out something different happens when the reason things are crazy is that the U.S. government itself is crazy. It's that the U.S. president has grabbed the wheel, and he doesn't drink, so we know he's not drunk, but boy, he sure is driving like he's drunk. I mean, when the problem is the actions of the U.S. government, instead of fleeing to the U.S. government for safety, now people flee away from the U.S. government to find safety. And so unlike every other economic crisis in modern history, people in this economic crisis, induced by Donald Trump, people today, at the beginning of the day, started selling their U.S. treasuries. A lot. And that is not just an inversion of typical economic behavior. That indicates an inversion of America's role in the world as the dominant economy. Also, in practical terms, a sell-off like that in the U.S. bond market, I mean, that portends a way bigger economic disaster for the United States than Trump tanking the stock market over the past week. Right? The bond market falling apart is a much bigger deal than the stock market falling apart in terms of the fundamentals of who we are in the world and how our money and our economy works. Because the stability of the U.S. bond market is what we depend on essentially for the spine of our economy. Everything from mortgage rates in the housing market to the integrity of our multi-trillion-dollar national debt. So yes, the stock market stuff under Trump has been scary, but if the bond market blows up, say goodbye to the U.S. economy. And today, what happened is the bond market started blowing up. When that happened at the opening of the bond markets today, that's apparently what turned things around. That's how we discovered this lovely cave that Donald Trump led us into today on his tariff policy. NBC News reports tonight that Trump caved. Trump reversed course on his tariff gambit today because of, quote, deep concern bordering on panic from his top economic officials regarding the bond markets. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, not always allies in the various tariff debates at the White House, nevertheless presented a united front today to the president, urging a pause on what he was doing on tariffs, a pause, quote, over concerns about the bond markets. My colleague Chris Hayes, I think, nutted up what happened here very well today. He posted this on Blue Sky. Quote, you set the house on fire, watched it burn, and then lost your nerve and put it out. You now have a partially burned house. Great job. Exactly.